My name is Rachel Marshall, and I will be talking about pairing the right activity with the right reinforcement, specifically with students with autism when they have a physical activity to do. What we're going to look at first is what reinforcement is and why it is so important. The next thing that we're going to look at is physical activity in students with autism spectrum disorder. Next, we're going to look at using reinforcement with physical activity. And last, we're going to look at how reinforcement is used in my autistic support classroom on a day-to-day basis and how I incorporate physical activity into my classroom. So what is reinforcement? According to the dictionary, reinforcement is defined as something used to strengthen an individual's response to a certain situation. Some examples of reinforcement are social. So this could be verbal praise, high fives. You could give a student some tickles. The next area is a tangible reinforcer. So this could be toys, electronics such as a DVD player, an iPad. The smartboard is reinforcing for some students. And next is edibles. Edibles also falls into the tangible items because it's an item that you can give. However, I included it as a separate item just for the sake of this presentation. So examples of that are really any type of food. You could do Skittles, Goldfish. I have some students that really enjoy Coke, pudding. Any kind of food or drink that you can think of could fall under that category for a reinforcer. Next, I'm going to show you two options for reinforcement. The first is an edible tray. So this picture here is just a bead organizer that I got from Michael's, but you could really get it from any craft store. And this is what we use in my classroom, and you can get various sizes depending on the type of edible or food that you are using with your students. I recommend with the edible tray putting the student's name on the top just so that you don't get it confused with other students who might have edible trays in the classroom. The next one that we're going to talk about is the toy bin. So this is where you can store students' favorite toys for quick and easy access to reinforcement that can easily be transported. It's really important also to have this handle and the lock so that way toys don't fall out, and the handle is quick, easy access from either parts in the classroom or even your room to recess or your room to the physical education classroom. Next, we're going to talk about why students need different types of reinforcement. So I talked about social reinforcement, tangible items, or edibles. For some students, especially students who have autism spectrum disorder, giving them verbal praise has no significant meaning. If you say good job to a student, it may not mean much, if anything at all, depending on their ability level. But if you pair that verbal praise, so that good job, with a goldfish, then they have a better understanding that they did something right in order to get that item. Ultimately, as educators and maybe parents, social reinforcement is the goal because it's the most natural across environments. When you go into a general education classroom, you don't see the teacher handing out Skittles for every correct answer. That's because students in the general education setting are able to work well for social reinforcement. Now, it is important to note that for some students, this may not be possible just due to their ability levels, and that is okay. But we do want to use social reinforcements and really pair ourselves as valuable with the student as much as we can. So why do we reinforce? We reinforce to increase the likelihood of that positive behavior occurring again. So we want to give that positive reinforcement in order for the student to be more likely to perform that positive behavior again. This is based off of B.F. Skinner, he studied that the consequence to a reinforcer is something that the individual finds rewarding, and it's also known as positive reinforcement, like I just talked about. It's very important that when you are giving reinforcement, that it is something that the student finds valuable. I currently have a student who does not like pretzels, and so if I were to give her a pretzel, just because it would be considered an edible, it doesn't mean it's rewarding for that student. Next, we're going to talk about physical activity and autism spectrum disorder. Autism spectrum disorder is a communication disorder that affects social, conversational language, and organizational skills. Most of the time when you see behaviors, they are due to the student's inability to be able to express themselves. Because it is primarily a communication disorder. So now let's look at physical activity and the skills that are required. Physical activity requires social, physical, communication skills, and behavioral development. Now, when you compare autism spectrum disorder and physical activity, you'll see that a lot of those skills that are needed for physical activity we don't have yet for some students who have autism spectrum disorder. Just because they don't have them yet does not mean that they won't ever be able to acquire those skills. We're first going to talk about what the benefits of physical activity are within the general population. So physical activity can build relationships with others. It decreases overall negative behaviors. It has a positive on your health benefits, so your heart, just staying healthy. It works on developing different skills, and it increases the overall quality of life. Now let's look at the benefits of physical activity for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. For individuals with autism, when they participate in a physical activity, they are able to have a satisfaction with life and free time. Many times students with autism have difficulty when given free time because they do very well in a structured environment, and free time is not structured, typically. However, when we teach those physical activity skills, we are giving them the opportunity to branch out and figure out what to do with their free time. It also gives them that feeling of accomplishment or achieving an activity. It boosts their self-esteem. It gives them overall happiness and joy to be able to do something and finish it and do it well. And it gives the individual the opportunity for choice and control. It's much better to tell a student, you have these 5 options to choose from, rather than just giving them something and having them do it. This gives them that feeling that they're in charge and they can pick something that they really, really enjoy. It also gives individuals something to do and releases some stress for families or some staff looking for constant schedules. So this goes back to that free time. Not every second of the day has to be structured when you can teach those physical activities and work on those free time skills and giving students options. However, despite the positive benefits, individuals with autism spectrum disorder engage in physical activity less than those without autism spectrum disorder. So, how can we teach individuals with autism spectrum disorder to reap all of those amazing benefits that we just talked about for physical activity? We need to use reinforcement. This is crucial when pairing a non-preferred task, like we know the studies have shown, with reinforcement. You're pairing something that students may not like with something that students definitely do like. That increases the likelihood that the student will be able to participate in the activity again. Before we go on, I want you to stop and think about what you wrote down for questions 1 and 2 on your worksheet. Does the reinforcement you experience increase the likelihood of that behavior occurring again? If it does, that's great. You paired an activity with an appropriate reinforcement for yourself. If no, think as we go on about how a more appropriate reinforcement would affect that behavior. Let's talk about reinforcement and physical activity some more. Since physical activity is not as reinforcing, or it's not as much of a preferred activity for as much as other activities are for students with autism, it's important to know what is motivating for the students. So for example, lifting weights is not something that I enjoy, and it's not something that I would find motivating. However, if you told me that after I do 20 lifts with a 10-pound weight, I could get a Frosty from Wendy's, I am significantly more likely to engage in that non-preferred activity and complete the behavior because the reinforcer matches the demand. We're going to talk more about how we can pair the right reinforcer with the right activity. So how can you find exactly what is reinforcing? We have a couple of ways to do so. The first and the biggest way to find out what's reinforcing for a student is by doing reinforcer assessments. These are fantastic ways to figure out what a student likes and what a student doesn't like in a short amount of time. Next, you can just use trial and error, especially if you are a new teacher or you have new toys in the classroom or you have new social reinforcers that you want to try out. Just trial and error. See if the students like it, see what their motivation is. Next, you want to always remember to have fun with the student to find out what's reinforcing. If you're not having fun with the toy or the action that you want the student to enjoy as well, then the student's not going to want to do it either, because they're looking for you and they're looking for your reaction. So you want to make sure to let your guard down and really have fun with the reinforcer. As you go on, it's important to always collect data. Data is going to be crucial in making sure that the items that you pick stay reinforcing and don't lack in any kind of way. Once you have a list of items, what you want to do is make a list of the individual's most preferred items to their aversive or least preferred items. So this will help you when using differential reinforcement. And it also is good to know if you have an activity that you know the student does not like. Let's say the student really does not enjoy jumping rope. You're going to want to pair jumping rope with one of their most preferred items. So when they do it, they get that item and they pair jumping rope with something good. Here's some more tips for using reinforcement in physical activity. You want to use positive reinforcement for when the individual uses positive behavior or shows the desired skill. Next, all reinforcement should have value and be appropriate for the student's age. This is very important, as I have seen some middle school and high school students have Elmo toys or Barney DVDs. You want to make sure that they are age appropriate, and we do keep in mind the developmental age of some of our developmental abilities, I should say, of some of our students. But you want to make them as age appropriate as possible. Use physical activity as a reward and not a punishment. So don't say to a student, if you don't complete this worksheet, you're going to have to go do a lap around the gym. Physical activity should not be a punishment. It's already a non-preferred for many students with autism, so you don't want to pair physical activity with a punishment, because then you're going to go backwards in your ability to be able to have the student really enjoy physical activity and want to do it more. And finally, you want to reinforce more in the beginning stages and then reduce reinforcement gradually, so individuals are not dependent on reinforcement to complete the task. This is called reinforcer or prompt dependency, when the students become dependent on receiving something after every time they complete it. Want them to be able to gradually fade that reinforcer, so that way maybe they just get one reinforcer at the end, whether that's a social, tangible, and edible item. Now I'm going to talk about reinforcement in my classroom. I currently teach autistic support for grades 3 through 5 at an elementary school in Harrisburg. I'll be going into my 4th year in this field. The website that I use most often to find my resources for reinforcement or to find my reinforcer assessments is Pattern. They are a phenomenal resource, not just for students with autism or if you're a teacher for autistic support, but they really are a phenomenal resource for educators. If you have any questions or you're looking for ideas, I highly recommend going to that website, or you can contact me. In my classroom, we reinforce using a variable ratio, or VR. So this means that we reinforce a student based on their average number of responses or demands. So if a student's VR is set at 7, we reinforce on average every 7 demands. We do this to keep it spontaneous. We don't want students to ever expect that they will get a Skittle after every 6 questions. It might be every 5, it might be every 6, it might be every 8. Just as long as the average at the end of the session is 7, then we've stuck to their VR. A common question that I get from substitutes, most of the time they're paraprofessional substitutes that come into my classroom, or just really anyone that comes to my classroom, is, aren't you just bribing the students by having them do what you want them to do with the Skittle or with the iPad? And I very nicely just have to say no. And this chart is a great comparison of reinforcement versus bribery. So first, reinforcement follows a behavior and results in an increase in future responding. Bribery is the act of offering a preferred item or activity in attempts to influence a behavior in that moment. Reinforced behaviors result in motivated stimuli after the behavior occurs. Bribed behaviors occur only after receiving the item or the activity first. Reinforcement strengthens, maintains, and increases the behavior. Bribery only influences the behavior in that moment. Reinforcement increases the likelihood of a behavior occurring again. Bribery does not result in an increase in future responding because you're solely focusing on that one moment. Learned behaviors are followed by reinforcement. Influence behaviors occur due to receiving a bribe before the behavior occurs. Reinforcement predicts the future probability of the behavior. Bribery only suggests a moment of the behavior. And finally, reinforcement is the behavior occurs before access to the reinforcer. So the student does something and then they get something. Bribery, the reward is delivered before the behavior occurs. So if you do this worksheet, I'll give you a Skittle. Here, take the Skittle, and then the student does the worksheet. That's bribery. In my classroom, we use and teach physical activity in different ways. So when teaching physical activity, we use imitation just to teach different motor movements. I can also do this when talking to students in a physical education class. So when students are taught new skills or something that I know maybe they don't know yet. So for basketball, if I say do this and I demonstrate how to bounce the ball, once the student imitates that action, so once I say do this and the student does that action of bouncing the ball, I'm going to reinforce based on their individual needs. So that means I might reinforce with an edible, a social reinforcement, or a tangible item right in that moment. But I want to make sure that whatever I choose, it is quick and doesn't take a whole lot of time because we want to keep them engaged in that physical activity. And you also want to make sure that this is a very preferred item based on their needs and by doing those reinforcer assessments. It's also important to note that many students like different things in different areas. So what could be really reinforcing in my classroom may not be as reinforcing in the gym. the student might have another thing that's really reinforcing for the student. So doing reinforcer assessments throughout the school even is a great way to really see what's reinforcing for the student across all settings. In conclusion, if behaviors are continuing to occur during a physical activity, it's really important to ask yourself the following questions. First, you want to ask yourself, am I using appropriate reinforcement for the student that is highly reinforcing to match the rigor of the activity? And that's why it's so important when you are talking about making a list of the most preferred to the least preferred, to really choose items that are near the top of the list, so that highly preferred item for activities that you know the student does not like, or maybe it's something that's new. You want to set the student up for success and keep their motivation high. So if you are continuing to see those negative behaviors, or the student is not performing the task like you typically see, that's the first question to ask yourself. Next, you want to ask yourself if you are using the reinforcement as often as you should based on the student's need. So maybe the student's reinforcers are right and you know that you're giving highly reinforcing items, but maybe you're not giving them as often as you should. I see this a lot, especially when students are doing so well and you just want to let them go and you want to let them do their thing. However, we have to remember that students still need reinforcement and that they're still doing a physical activity that they don't find reinforcing. So we really want to keep pairing that non-preferred activity with the preferred activity. Reinforcement and motivation are always changing for students. I have students in my classroom that we say they have a fleeting motivation for items. So they like the toy train one day, but 2 days later they don't like it as much. And that's okay. It's important to be flexible and to meet your students' needs by regularly assessing what items are motivating for them during certain activities. When you do this, you'll be more likely to pair the right reinforcer with the right activity. And that's why those reinforcer assessments are key. You'll be able to find what suits the student well and what changes are happening week to week, month to month, and year to year. As a student grows, their interests change, just like our interests change as we have grown up. This is my references page. Majority of the information that I got looked at the books that we had for our class, so supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorder and recreation, and strategies for inclusion, a handbook for physical educators. I hope that you were able to learn more about how to pair the right reinforcer with the right activity, and I hope that this helps in your success with working with students with autism or just working with students in general. Thank you.